Let me tell you something that happens to almost every gardener at some point. You wake up on a warm summer morning feeling genuinely excited about your garden. You pour yourself a cup of coffee, step outside, and take a deep breath of that fresh morning air. Everything feels peaceful. Everything feels promising. And then you get closer to your beds and your stomach just drops. Your tomato plant that looked perfectly fine yesterday, the leaves are shredded. Your pepper stems have insects crawling all over them like they received a formal invitation. And that squash plant you started indoors from seed, the one you protected through late frosts and carefully hardened off before transplanting, it's drooping. Something found it in the night and made a meal out of it. And so you do what feels logical. You drive to the nearest garden store, or scan the shelves, pick up something that promises to solve your problem, come home and spray everything in sight. And for a little while it seems to work. The insects disappear. Your plants look better. You feel like you finally got ahead of it. But 2 weeks later, there they are again. Same pests, same damage, sometimes even worse than before. And you find yourself standing in the same aisle of the same store buying the same bottle all over again. That cycle is exhausting. And what makes it even more frustrating is that it never seems to fully resolve. You're always reacting, always one step behind, always treating the symptoms instead of the actual cause. I lived in that cycle for a long time, trying product after product, technique after technique, getting temporary relief but never lasting results. And I started to genuinely wonder whether growing a healthy, productive garden without constant chemical intervention was even possible. It turns out it absolutely is. But the answer didn't come from a new product or a modern agricultural breakthrough. It came from something much older, much quieter, and honestly, much wiser. I started reading about how certain traditional farming communities, particularly Amish settlements in places like Holmes County, Ohio, have been producing abundant, healthy food for generations without ever relying on synthetic pesticides. Not as a recent experiment, not as a trend, but as a way of life that has been passed down through families for over 300 years. And the results speak for themselves. Their gardens are productive, their plants are healthy, their yields are consistent. And they accomplish all of this using nothing more than careful observation, thoughtful design, and a deep respect for how natural systems actually work. When I first came across this, I'll be honest with you, part of me was doubtful. I had been growing food for a long time. I considered myself a reasonably informed gardener. And the idea that the solution to my pest problems was something I could learn from people who don't use modern agricultural inputs felt almost too simple. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that simple doesn't mean ineffective. In fact, sometimes the simplest approaches are the ones that work the most reliably, because they're built on principles that have been tested not for a few years but for centuries. So today I want to walk you through the core principles behind this way of gardening, how it actually works, why it works, and how you can begin applying it in your own backyard starting this season. And stay with me through the whole video because near the end I'm going to share one specific technique for protecting young seedlings that most gardening guides never mention, and it might be the most practical tip I've ever come across. Let's get into it. The very first thing that separates traditional natural gardening from the conventional approach most of us grew up with is where the focus goes. When most gardeners see pest damage, their attention goes immediately to the plant and whatever is eating it. The instinct is to find the bug and eliminate it, which makes sense on the surface. But what traditional growers figured out a long time ago is that the real conversation isn't happening on the leaf. It's happening underground. Soil health is the foundation of everything, and I mean that quite literally. The condition of your soil determines the condition of your plants, and the condition of your plants determines how attractive they are to pests in the first place. This is a concept that modern plant biology has actually confirmed through decades of research, but traditional growers understood it intuitively long before the science caught up. Here is what happens at a biological level. Soil that is rich in organic matter and teeming with microbial life produces plants that are fundamentally different from plants grown in depleted or chemically dependent soil. The root systems are stronger and more developed. The cell walls within the plant tissue are denser and more resistant to damage. And the plant produces higher concentrations of its own natural defensive compounds, the chemicals it uses to protect itself from insects and disease. Research coming out of agricultural universities has demonstrated measurable differences in pest resistance between plants grown in biologically active, compost-amended soil versus plants grown in conventional conditions. This isn't a theory, it's documented, repeatable science. So the first practical step is this. Every spring, before you put a single plant in the ground, spread a generous layer of well-aged compost across your garden beds and work it into the upper several inches of soil. If you have access to composted animal manure, incorporating that along with plant-based compost creates an especially diverse and active soil environment. The combination of different organic materials feeds a wider variety of soil microorganisms, which in turn creates a richer, more complex growing environment for your plants. Now here is the important part that most people miss. This is not a one-time fix. The traditional approach to soil building is cumulative. You add organic matter every single season, year after year, and over time the biology of your soil becomes increasingly rich and self-sustaining. The first year you might notice modest improvements. By the third or fourth year of consistent soil building, the difference in your plants will be genuinely striking. Thicker stems, deeper color, faster recovery when something does take a bite out of them. More vigorous growth overall. If you are gardening in a cooler climate where your growing season is relatively short, I make it a priority to get your compost into the beds as early in spring as the ground will allow. Give the soil biology several weeks to wake up and get active before you start transplanting. If you are in a warmer region where winter temperatures stay mild, you can begin your soil preparation even earlier and get a significant head start on the season. The second principle is one that will completely change the way you think about garden layout. And once you understand why it works, you will never want to go back to the old way of doing things. Most of us were taught to plant our gardens in organized single-crop rows, all the tomatoes together, all the beans together, all the squash in one section. It looks neat, it makes harvesting straightforward, but from a pest management perspective, it is one of the worst things you can do. Here is why. The majority of garden pests locate their preferred host plants primarily through smell. They are following chemical signals that the plants release into the air, and when you plant an entire row of the same crop, you are essentially broadcasting a massive concentrated signal that says, "Come here, there is plenty of food, bring your friends." The solution that traditional growers developed is to never plant any crop in isolation. Instead, you deliberately mix aromatic herbs and flowering plants in among your vegetables so that their strong scents disrupt and confuse the chemical signals your crops are sending out. Researchers in the field of entomology refer to this as olfactory masking. The pest arrives in your garden, starts following the scent trail toward your tomatoes, and gets completely disoriented because the basil and the marigolds and the dill are sending out competing signals from every direction. The pest gives up and moves on to find an easier target somewhere else. Let me give you some specific combinations that have proven effective over many generations of practice. Basil planted close to tomatoes is one of the most well-documented pairings in traditional gardening. The volatile oils that basil releases are deeply unpleasant to aphids, whiteflies, and several species of caterpillar that commonly feed on tomato plants. Plant basil every few feet among your tomatoes, and you create a kind of aromatic shield around the entire planting. For brassica crops like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and kale, interplanting with dill or cilantro serves a double purpose. That the strong scent of these herbs deters the moths that lay eggs on brassica leaves. But when those herbs flower, which they do relatively quickly, they attract a whole community of parasitic wasps and beneficial flies that actively hunt the very caterpillars you are trying to protect your plants from. So you are doing two things simultaneously: pushing pests away and pulling in their natural predators. French marigolds deserve a special mention here because their benefits operate both above and below the soil surface. Above ground, their scent deters a range of common pests, including whiteflies and certain beetles. Below ground, their roots release specific compounds that suppress harmful nematodes, which are microscopic soil-dwelling organisms that can cause serious root damage in many garden crops. This dual action has been studied and confirmed by agricultural researchers, and it explains why marigolds have been a companion planting staple in traditional gardens for so many generations. The third principle is the one that I think represents the biggest shift in mindset for most conventional gardeners. And it is this: a healthy garden is not a garden with no insects. It is a garden with the right balance of insects. And your job is not to eliminate all insect life, but to create conditions that favor the insects working in your interest. Think about what is actually available to you if you create the right environment. A single ladybug consumes an enormous number of aphids every day. Lacewing larvae are aggressive and highly effective predators of soft-bodied insects. The parasitic wasps seek out caterpillars and lay their eggs inside them, eliminating the pest without any intervention on your part. Ground beetles patrol the soil surface after dark, hunting slugs, cutworms, and soil-dwelling grubs. These creatures are extraordinarily effective, and they are free. They require no purchasing, no application, no timing, no protective gear. They just need a garden that gives them what they need to survive and thrive. The way you invite and retain these beneficial insects is by providing them with two things: food and habitat. For food, you need flowering plants that produce nectar and pollen throughout the entire growing season. The best approach is to dedicate a strip of garden space, even a narrow one, to a continuous succession of flowering plants. Sweet alyssum blooms prolifically and stays relatively compact. Yarrow produces flat-topped flower clusters that are magnets for beneficial insects and blooms for an extended period. Dill and fennel, when allowed to flower, attract an enormous variety of predatory and parasitic insects. These plantings don't need to be elaborate or large. Even a modest border of mixed flowering herbs and annuals can support a thriving population of beneficial insects throughout the season. For habitat, the key insight is that beneficial insects need more than just food. They need places to shelter, to reproduce, and to overwinter safely. A garden that is kept completely bare between the rows, with every inch of soil exposed and every corner neatly trimmed, offers very little of this. Leaving a small area of undisturbed ground near your garden, allowing some low-growing plants to fill in between rows, placing a few flat stones or a small brush pile nearby, these small gestures create the kind of layered, complex habitat that beneficial insects need. It doesn't need to look wild or untidy, but it does need to offer something more than bare ground and manicured edges. The fourth principle sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, but in practice it might be the single most impactful habit you can build as a gardener. It is simply this: pay close attention to your garden every single day. Traditional growers in close-knit agricultural communities have always understood that prevention is far more effective than treatment, and consistent daily observation is what makes prevention possible. The practice looks like this. Every morning, ideally in the cooler early hours before the heat of the day sets in, you take a slow, unhurried walk through your garden. You are not just walking past. You are looking closely. You are turning leaves over and examining their undersides. You are running your eyes along stems and checking the soil surface around the base of your plants. You are looking for the early signs of pest activity before it has a chance to escalate. When you find something, you deal with it immediately and by hand. A few caterpillars dropped into a container of soapy water, a cluster of eggs scraped off the underside of a squash leaf, a handful of beetles collected and removed. This kind of direct, hands-on intervention sounds labor-intensive, but it actually takes very little time when you do it consistently. Because you are always catching problems when they are small and manageable, before they have compounded into something that requires a major response. The contrast with the conventional reactive approach is stark. When you only check your garden occasionally and wait until damage is clearly visible before taking action, you are always dealing with established infestations. And established infestations are genuinely difficult to resolve without aggressive intervention. The daily observation habit keeps you permanently ahead of the curve. You are never surprised. You are never overwhelmed. And you develop over time an increasingly refined sense of what is normal in your garden, what healthy plants look like, what early warning signs look like, and how quickly different situations tend to develop. This kind of intimate knowledge of your own garden is something that no product can give you. It comes only from consistent, attentive presence, and it makes you a fundamentally more effective grower in every dimension, not just pest management. The fifth principle involves a clever piece of strategic thinking that turns the pest's own instincts against it. Rather than trying to keep every pest out of your entire garden, you deliberately provide them with an alternative destination that they find even more appealing than your main crops. This approach is commonly known as trap cropping, and it is one of the most elegant natural pest management strategies ever developed. The way it works is straightforward. You identify a plant that your target pest finds irresistible, something it prefers even over the crops you are trying to protect. You plant that decoy crop in a strategic location, typically around the perimeter of your garden or at the ends of your main rows. The pests find the decoy first, settle in, and largely leave your primary planting alone. You then have options for how to handle the pest population on the decoy plants. You can remove and dispose of those plants once they are loaded with pests. Or better yet, you can leave them and allow the beneficial insect population you have been cultivating to move in and do the work for you. Nasturtiums are a classic example of an effective trap crop. They have a particular appeal to aphids that makes them dramatically more attractive than most vegetables. Planting nasturtiums around the outside of your garden draws aphid populations to a location where they are easier to monitor and manage, while keeping the pressure on your beans, peppers, and other crops much lower. And nasturtiums are beautiful, easy to grow, and completely edible, so you are not giving up that garden space for nothing. Radishes serve a similar function for flea beetles, which are a significant pest on eggplant and young brassica transplants. Planting a row of radishes in front of your main eggplant or cabbage planting draws the flea beetles to the radish foliage first. The radish tops take the damage and your main crop stays largely protected. It is a simple, low-cost strategy that requires almost no ongoing effort once established. For gardeners who grow summer squash, winter squash, or pumpkins, planting one or two large, vigorous squash varieties like Blue Hubbard at the far edges of the growing area can dramatically reduce pressure from vine borers and cucumber beetles on your primary squash crop. Those pest species are strongly attracted to the larger, more robust plants and tend to congregate there, leaving your main planting comparatively undisturbed. The beauty of trap cropping as a strategy is that it works with the natural behavior of the pest rather than trying to override it. You are not asking insects to stop being what they are. You are simply redirecting their attention somewhere more convenient for you. The sixth and final principle covers what to do when, despite all your preventive measures, you are dealing with pest pressure that needs a direct response. Because even in the most carefully designed, natural garden, there will be seasons or situations where something needs more immediate attention. And for those moments, traditional growers have long relied on simple homemade preparations made from common kitchen ingredients. The most effective and widely used of these is a basic deterrent spray made from garlic and hot peppers. The preparation could not be simpler. Take several cloves of fresh garlic and a few hot peppers, chop them roughly, and steep them in water overnight. The following morning, strain the liquid. Add a small amount of plain liquid soap, which helps the spray adhere to leaf surfaces and also affects soft-bodied insects directly, and transfer it to a spray bottle. Apply this mixture to affected plants in the early morning or evening. I'm focusing especially on the undersides of leaves where most pest species prefer to shelter and feed. The combination of garlic and hot pepper compounds creates an environment on the plant surface that insects find deeply unpleasant. It doesn't kill them outright the way a synthetic pesticide would, but it makes your plants unappealing enough that the pests relocate. Reapply every several days and after significant rainfall. What is important to understand about this spray is that it is one component of a broader system, not a standalone solution. Used alone, it provides temporary relief. Used in combination with healthy soil, companion planting, a thriving beneficial insect population, daily observation, and strategic trap cropping, it fills in the gaps and handles the situations where everything else needs a little backup. Now, before I wrap up, I want to share one specific technique that I think is genuinely underappreciated and rarely talked about in mainstream gardening resources. It is something that traditional growers have used for generations to protect young transplants during the most vulnerable period of their development, and it is almost absurdly simple. When you transplant young seedlings into the garden, cut a cardboard tube, the kind from a toilet paper roll or a paper towel roll cut into sections, and place one around the base of each transplant. Push it slightly into the soil so it makes good contact with the ground and let it rise a couple of inches above the soil surface. That is the entire technique. What this does is create a physical collar around the most vulnerable part of the young plant, the stem right at soil level. Cutworms, which are the larvae of certain moth species, move along the soil surface at night and sever plant stems at ground level. A single cutworm can destroy multiple transplants in a single night. And because the damage happens at the soil surface in the dark, many gardeners never even identify the cause. They just find their seedlings lying flat in the morning and assume something went wrong with the plant itself. The cardboard collar stops cutworms completely. They cannot get to the stem. And because cardboard breaks down naturally in the soil over several weeks, by the time it is decomposed, the plant's stem has matured and hardened to the point where cutworms can no longer damage it. No plastic, no chemicals, no ongoing maintenance, just a repurposed piece of cardboard and an understanding of when and how young plants are most at risk. I started using this approach a few seasons ago after losing multiple transplants every spring to what I eventually figured out was cutworm damage. Since making it a standard part of my transplanting routine, my seedling losses during establishment have dropped dramatically. It is one of those techniques that makes you wonder why it is not mentioned in every beginner gardening guide, because the results are so consistent and the effort required is essentially zero. So let us bring everything together. The approach we have covered today is not a collection of isolated tricks. It is a coherent, integrated system built on a set of timeless principles. You build strong soil every year through consistent organic matter additions, because strong soil grows strong plants that can handle pest pressure without falling apart. You design your garden to create confusion for pests and abundance for their natural enemies, using companion planting and insectary habitat. You pay close daily attention to your garden so that problems are caught and handled while they are still small. You use strategic decoy plantings to redirect pest populations away from what you care most about. And you keep a simple homemade spray on hand for the moments when a little extra deterrence is needed. None of this requires specialized knowledge or expensive inputs. It requires observation, patience, and a willingness to trust that natural systems, when you work with them rather than against them, are extraordinarily capable of managing themselves. If you have spent years feeling like your garden is a constant uphill battle against pests, I want you to know that it does not have to be that way. The cycle of spray and react and spray again is not inevitable. There is a different way of doing this, a way that feels less like warfare and more like partnership. and it has been working reliably for people who understood these principles long before synthetic pesticides ever existed. Give these ideas a try this season. Start with the one that feels most accessible to you, whether that is improving your soil, adding a companion planting or two, or simply committing to that daily morning walk through your garden. Build from there, and pay attention to what changes. I would genuinely love to hear how it goes for you. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these principles you are going to start with, or share what you have already tried and what results you have seen. Every gardener's experience adds something to the collective knowledge, and I read every comment. If this kind of content resonates with you, if you appreciate looking at gardening through the lens of traditional wisdom and natural systems rather than products and quick fixes, then make sure you subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of thing I will keep bringing you. There is so much more to explore, and I am genuinely excited to share it with you. Thanks for being here today. Take good care of your garden, and I will see you in the next one.